What up, peeps? This is Mike, aka Cobra Kai Wisdom, and I have been asked to share my Miyagi Box Theory. So here we go. Ever since part 1 came out, I've been trying to piece together the Miyagi Box Theory from what we know about Mr. Miyagi from the movies and what we also know from real life American, Japanese, and Okinawan history. Now, Mr. Miyagi is a beloved character. The Big Three and Ralph Macchio would never do anything to harm his character or his legacy, and I really believe that. But what they can do is add to it. Now, this is a man who was over 60 years old when we met him. He had a whole lifetime before he ever met Daniel LaRusso and we ever met him. Now, what Cobra Kai has always been about is shades of gray. It starts way back in season 1 with Johnny, with Daniel. Nobody is always good. Nobody is always bad. There's always shades of gray, and it's no different from any other character. We can do the same with Mr. Miyagi, or the show can, and I believe that at the end of it all, this theory, this story of Mr. Miyagi will end up showing Mr. Miyagi's humanity on a deeper level, and in fact may have us end up loving him even more, and have Daniel end up loving him and respecting him and relating to him even more, which will make him a better person and a better sensei. So let's have a little bit of background first. Now, it was believed that we never learned Mr. Miyagi's first name in the Karate Kid trilogy. That was what we believed. Then the next Karate Kid comes out, and at the very beginning, Mr. Miyagi and the 442nd are somehow being honored again by the President of the United States, and Mr. Miyagi is there to accept an award. That's why he was in Boston. And when they are giving out this award, the announcer calls him Keisuke Miyagi. So that was believed to be Mr. Miyagi's first name. We now know his first name. It's Keisuke. Fast forward years later, we have Cobra Kai Season 1. We have Mr. Miyagi's gravestone. And the gravestone says Nariyoshi Miyagi, born in 1924. So there's 2 names. The Big Three explained that, in fact, we did learn Mr. Miyagi's first name in the Karate Kid trilogy. They explained that Chosen's sign at the airport, when Mr. Miyagi and Daniel first arrived, it's written in Japanese, but what it says, if you translate it, is Nariyoshi Miyagi. So in the Karate Kid 2, it is revealed that Mr. Miyagi's first name was actually Nariyoshi, and that was the name that they decided to use, the one that was actually used first in the trilogy. That's his real name. Fast forward to Season 3, the letter to Yukie is signed Nariyoshi Miyagi. Now, the Big Three says that all movies that are part of the Miyagi-verse that Mr. Miyagi is in are canon. And if that's the case, then both names are canon. Now, how could that be? Here's what we know. If that's the case, then Mr. Miyagi was known as Nariyoshi in his early years. That's how Yukie knows him. And he was also known as Nariyoshi in his later years. That's how Daniel knows him. But he's known in the military as Keisuke Miyagi. Why? Here's where we start getting into Season 6 and what we've learned from the box and all of its content. So, in part 1, Daniel finds a passport that says Keisuke Miyagi, born on July 28th, 1918. 6 years older than Nariyoshi's birth. Why the date change? The date he was admitted was September 16th, 1942, right in the middle of World War II. And the passport is signed by an immigrant inspector named John Luoma. Now, this is an important name. Keep it in the back of your mind. John Luoma. So we know that Mr. Miyagi emigrated when he was 18 years old. That's when he and Sato had the falling out over Yukie, which would mean, if we're going by Nariyoshi's date of birth, that he emigrated to the United States in 1942. So what we all figured was that Mr. Miyagi came to the U.S., joined the military, and fought in the 442nd. Well, if you're looking at real history, that is not possible. That was not possible. During World War II, only United States citizens were allowed to join the United States military. Going back even further, in the 1870s, it was decided by the United States government in its infinite wisdom that we didn't like Asian people, and we wanted to make it harder for Asians to become citizens. In 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Issei, or Japanese-born people, were no longer eligible to become U.S. citizens. Then 2 years later, in 1924, the U.S. passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which stopped all immigration from Asia, including Japan and Okinawa. So what that meant was that in 1942, Nariyoshi Miyagi was not eligible to immigrate to the U.S., become a citizen, or join the military. What that means is he needed a new identity. And then Keisuke Miyagi was born. Keisuke Miyagi, born in 1918. In 1918, this explains the 6-year difference. In 18, it was hard for Japanese to become a citizen, but it wasn't impossible like it was years later. Nisei, or second-generation Japanese, who were born in the United States, were still allowed to become citizens at this point. Now, here's where things get a little screwy with the timeline. As I said, the passport still says that he was born in Japan, still says he was admitted in 1942. So my thought on that is maybe it's a renewed passport, that Keisuke was born in 1918, and he still emigrated before 1922, when it was permitted for Japanese to emigrate to the U.S. But in any event, it's clearly a fake passport, which he needed to stay here in the U.S. and join the military. So Keisuke Miyagi joins the 442nd and is awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, at some point between 1942 and 1944, Mr. Miyagi is in Hawaii and meets the future Mrs. Miyagi. The two of them get married. At some point, she gets pregnant with their firstborn child. On November 2nd, 1944, Mrs. Miyagi and the baby die while Mr. Miyagi is still away in Europe at war. We know she dies in an internment camp from complications at birth and no doctor come, as Mr. Miyagi said. That somehow, some way, she was stuck in an internment camp and no doctor came to help her. What we've also learned from the article, from the news article from season 6, The Box, is that on May 3rd, 1947, someone named Jim Watkins was hospitalized from a severe beating and a valuable necklace was stolen. So here's my theory. And I don't think we're going to be told about it in part 2 or part 3. I think we're going to see it. I think we're going to see young Miyagi in all his glory, and there's going to be scenes and a storyline that's going to be shown for us, and I think it's going to be absolutely beautiful. So here's my theory. The initial thought, which I understand when this whole Miyagi Box Theory came out and the story of him assaulting and robbing someone, is that Mr. Miyagi would never. He's peaceful. He was always in control. He would never do something like this. But was he always in control? Think about one time where we saw Mr. Miyagi completely out of control. The Mr. Miyagi drunk scene, the famous scene in the original Karate Kid. This is 40 years later. It's his anniversary. He's drunk to the point that he basically passes out, and he's still feeling regret. He's talking about land of free, home of brave, no doctor come. While he was out serving his country, that he had to change his identity just to get in, his wife was left to die. So here's the theory. Mr. Miyagi did not steal a necklace. He took it back. It was his wife's necklace. This Jim Watkins character was somehow involved in the death of Mrs. Miyagi. Was he a prison guard? Was he the person who was responsible for not calling the doctor? Whatever he is, he's a bad guy. He lets her die, and then he takes Mrs. Miyagi's necklace after she dies. 2 years later, Mr. Miyagi tracks down Jim Watkins and asks for the necklace back. At this point, I believe Watkins says something horrible, something truly, truly horrible, like, glad she's dead, glad your baby died, one less Asian that we have to deal with. Something like that just makes his blood boil and everyone's blood boil. And Mr. Miyagi, for the first time in his life, absolutely loses it, beats the living shit out of Watkins, and takes his wife's necklace back. Now, while we are probably cheering at this moment that Mr. Miyagi clocks this SOB, Mr. Miyagi himself probably feels shame over what he's done. This is not his character. This is not the Miyagi-Do way. Fighting always last answer to problem. But meanwhile, Watkins wakes up in a hospital and, like the whiny asshole that he probably is, cries about the fact that he's been assaulted and robbed. Now, Mr. Miyagi knows that in 1947, an Asian, even an Asian American, is never going to be believed over a white guy, to put it bluntly. So what that means is that Keisuke Miyagi needs to disappear. But it's okay, because Keisuke Miyagi was a fake identity anyway. So what is good is that Mr. Miyagi has friends who can help him. So an article is written about this incident, the news article that Daniel and Amanda and Chosen find. This news article, the author of which is a gentleman named John Luoma. Yes, the same individual who signed Mr. Miyagi's fake passport in 1942 is the same person who wrote this news article. He was the immigration inspector, and now he's a reporter for this newspaper. That tells me that he's a friend. He's doing something, and he's writing this article for the purpose of somehow helping Mr. Miyagi. My guess is by diverting everyone's attention to a fake identity named Keisuke Miyagi. So the fake identity disappears. And this is some Shawshank shit going on right here. Keisuke Miyagi, the fake identity, disappears. But Mr. Miyagi knows that people would still recognize his face, so he needs to escape the country, at least for some time as well. What we know is that the owner of the gym, Pop Pop, somehow helps Mr. Miyagi escape the country. And I presume because Chosen found some Chinese money in the box that Mr. Miyagi probably escapes to China. He wouldn't go back to Okinawa because he wasn't welcome there. So he probably goes to China, somehow gets involved in the Seikai Taikai, which was probably happening in China that year. He's off balance and he needs to regain it. And there's probably a whole storyline, I'm guessing, involving Master Kim, maybe even involving Sato, involving the Seikai Taikai tournament at that time, where Mr. Miyagi somehow regains his balance and forges the path to becoming the person that we meet in The Karate Kid. He returns to the U.S. at some point. Either name is redeemed, or he just goes back to being Nariyoshi Miyagi again, which is why that's the name that Daniel knows as well. And in 1952, Japanese are once again allowed to become United States citizens, so Nariyoshi Miyagi can continue living in the U.S. until 1984 and beyond, when we meet him in the Karate Kid trilogy. So that's the theory. We shall see what happens starting November 15th.